You are listening to Ras Temari Radio, Offense Necessary, where we discuss everything but politics. My name is Zodi. I'm here with a good friend, Bailey.
Thank you.
It's nice to have you on.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Bailey and I have a slightly different experience from most people listening or most people in Addis Ababa who are either Ethiopian, and possibly Diaspora, meaning they left and possibly came back, or they're just Americans who came here. What Bailey and I have experienced in life, what is basically the subject of this episode, and that will be hopefully a recurring theme as part of Ras Temari Radio, where we discuss self-education in an informal way and talk about the relationship between that which is uniquely Ethiopian and the sort of foreign exposure or the experience, the interactions with that which is foreign, is really the experience of being a chameleon, of the experience of going back and forth in different cultures and finding oneself in place but also out of place. You put this very well as a chameleon who is out of place. Could you explain a little bit what you meant by a chameleon who is out of place?
Okay. So, I think the term for this context is a little bit philosophical, to be honest. A chameleon out of place. I mean, we all know chameleon is a reptile who, changes its skin color in order to adapt in its environment, right? So, for me, saying that as Habesha / Haitian American and African American as well, for me, it's more of trying to put myself or shapeshift or try to convey myself in a situation or in an environment where I actually fit in. But deep down, for me, I know that I will never be, how could I say this?
Right, it's like being at home everywhere and nowhere at the same place.
Like
right?
shape-shifting and...
Sure, and sometimes it can be an advantage and other times
it won't.
Be quite a
you feel
disadvantage.
empty a little bit. That's how I think with that context that I mentioned before, it's like feeling of emptiness in a way. I know it's a little bit gloomy and sad, but it makes sense in a way for people who resonate with me.
Right. So tell us a little bit. So I don't know if I mentioned this in our previous podcast, but
right.
I was born in the U.S. and spent most of my childhood in West Africa and was coming to Ethiopia mostly for vacation.
Okay.
But in recent years was in the U.S. again as an adult, and until about 6 years ago when I moved to Addis Ababa permanently. Tell us about frame this for us exactly. What's sort of generally where were you at different times in your life?
Okay, so I have to go back for my parents. So my dad is Haitian American, and my mom is Ethiopian, basically an Habesha person who is originally born from Gundet, but she lived her life in Harar, based in Harar, in Gurlibigabi, basically, all her life. But she moved to Piazza when she was in her teens, and she's a Piazza girl and through. And my dad he lived his life in Haiti, and he moved to the States when he was about I think 21.
Mm-hmm.
He migrated to New York first in Harlem, and then he went to Florida. Then most of his family went to Kentucky, because now we're all based in Houston. It's a little bit of everything.
Sure, yeah.
I hope you get what I mean.
Yeah.
So
more the middle of the country compared to I think a lot of Habeshas like myself who are more coastal. Yeah.
So, I mean, what was your question again?
Well, I mean, so just tell us generally. So for one thing, how did your parents meet? Did they meet here? Did they?
Yeah, they actually met here. He was a tourist. My mom is a very high-spirited person. She does not like the whole 9-to-5 type of work. She's very quirky in her ways, and she really was into tourism back then. She used to work in Gyun. For people who doesn't know the Gyun Hotel, it's around Stadium. Y'all should check that out. It's very nice. It's very vintage, but I like it.
Right.
I have a lot of memories there, swimming, very cold water.
Yeah,
but
many of us who, even those of us who came vacation, we swam at Gion.
And remember sort of when we were back then, we used to go to the big pool because we thought that we're gonna sink and not, just.
Right, swimming at Gion was a thing back in the day. There weren't all these swimming pools.
So my mom, going back to my mother, her name is Saba. So going back to Saba, she used to have her own it's an antique shop there. She's really into like, you know, selling antique Ethiopian artifacts, and she used to on her spare time she used to do a tour guide for different tourists. So my mom met my dad through an acquaintance. They're like, oh, you should meet this guy. He wants to see Addis Ababa, like in Toto made he wants to visit in Toto, he wants to go to Piazza, he wants to She was like, okay, whatever, fine, let's go. And surprisingly, when they met, when he told me, he was struck when he saw her. He's like, oh my god, Habesha Konjo, what is this? And she's a hotter chick, and he's like, okay, I'm digging this. And she didn't like him, to be honest. She turned him down 3 times. I mean, she was very professional with him, but she turned him down 3 times. And because she was like, okay, fine, let me give this
So
guy
were
a
you
chance.
born here, or were you born in?
I was born here.
Okay.
I was born here. So yeah, I was born here. Then I moved there when I was about like 6 months.
Okay.
Then I came back here when I was 4 years old.
Your parents lived separately? Or
No,
your mom moved
used
back?
to. So my dad is an architect.
Right.
My mom, like I said, she was into like tourism,
Right. So they moved back and forth together?
Okay, yes.
Gotcha.
They got
Generally,
married
yeah.
in Mexico, in Acapulco Beach. It was very, they knew what
Right,
romance back then.
Right.
They had their stuff together.
People were generally freer, I think.
Yeah, in the
those
80s,
days.
the late 90s.
90s, sure.
I think maybe the late 70s, I like them.
Sure.
But yeah, they had, everything was simpler back then.
Sure.
And yeah, that's how.
Right. So you mostly Texas and coming back and forth here. Where did you go to school when you were out here?
So yeah, I grew up here my entire life, but I used to go back and forth, like I said. So since from 1st grade up till I think 4 on the nets, from 4th grade up till 6th, Greek community school, international schools, both of them. But when I was learning there, my mom kind of freaked out as she started seeing my dialect change. Like I started to forget my Amharic.
Right.
And I was more emphasizing on French and English because my dad is Haitian, and Haitian people, their basic language is French. So
right.
I was like, I have to learn French, I have to learn Spanish, or I have to da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And my mom was like, Rainy Kudim, she's forgetting her Amharic.
I mean, this is a common thing, I think, for kids who move
Right?
around.
I think so.
I have a cousin who's dealing with this now.
Mm-hmm.
It's great because I had this myself, English, French, Amharic at a very young age.
Yeah.
But depending where you go, it's so volatile. You can absorb a language so quickly.
Exactly. So coming
and
back
then
to
you
that
could-
point.
Yeah, and then you can lose it very.
Yeah, coming back to your point on this, so all my life I had to do the whole code switching thing. You know what I'm saying? Like,
right.
So
Code switching. Could you please explain?
So
what is
code
it?
switching is basically the skill or the art to change dialect when you change surroundings or when you change your environment. Let's say, for me, instance, as if I go to an Habesha community, I speak in Amharic. I have to say Salam Natroy, Siri, da 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 da.
Can you shift to another language while you're there, or mix
Yeah, I
language?
can.
Okay.
So if I go, let's say, to a Haitian community, there's no Haitian community in Addis Ababa, but like, let's say if I'm in New York, in Brooklyn, if I go to like a Haitian district, like I could either speak in Haitian Creole, which I'm horribly bad at, by the way, or French.
Could you explain really quickly to people who don't know what a Creole is? And
Creole
what
is
typical
okay.
Haitian
So going back to history, Haiti is the first republic who has been out of slavery in 1809 from the French Empire. So after they got their independence, Haitian people made the Haitian Creole by taking the Benin African language and spicing it up, changing it into a little broken French, and they merged it up. But let me remind you again, there's different types of Creole, as in Mauritius type, Haitian, and I
So,
forgot the...
so I when I was young, we had family friends randomly when I was in New York, and we're still in touch with them who are in Guadeloupe, which is a part of France. It's still a part of France. It's like literally like the way Hawaii is an American state. Guadeloupe is a very small couple islands. It's covered by Columbus, actually. And
around Brooklyn or Brooklyn?
Guadeloupe?
No, are you talking about New York?
Oh, so this is confusing. We're all over the map for our audience as well. We were in New York,
right?
And at different times we would come, even when we were living in West Africa.
Because Haitians are spread out. That's why I'm asking you.
No, we would visit.
We're found in the Midwest. Blah blah blah.
So along with Saint-Martin and some of these Martinique, some of these islands. These are island states, essentially département outre-mer, but they have their own Creole, right? Guadeloupean Creole. I think that's when I hear Creole, and I speak French. At the time, I spoke French.
Of course,
I still speak
you lived in Senegal,
correct?
Right.
But I have no understanding. Well, it's like it might as well
very
be
different, very difficult, by the way.
Language, right?
It's very difficult.
So
it's like learning is.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
People, it's very hard.
Right. If you're
you have to learn there.
You don't necessarily know Giz. Right?
Exactly.
Whereas Pidgin, I think. Jamaican Pidgin, which is English, is it?
I have no idea.
It's based off of English. It's a little bit closer. I mean, when you hear people sing in reggae doing Jamaican Pidgin, you can kind of understand a little bit more.
Or with Nigeria as well, I think.
Right. They call them pigeons as well, and then there's patois, which I think is even a little bit closer. But these are all variations of, and then dialect is the same language. People across dialects can pretty much understand each other. But, but regardless, you were speaking about how you have to you were able to shift. From one register to
I have to. It's a for me. It's a matter of survival and being accepted in a way, because it's like, let's say if I'm in an Habesha community, if I act too American, they're gonna be like, why can't you be like an Habesha, like be like this? And if I go to Haitian, if I'm conservative as a Caribbean person, I mean, of course, there are people who are very conservative with religion and how they were brought up, but Caribbean are very liberal, very sensual people. They're very in tune with their environment and their
fun-loving.
Fun-loving.
There's a lot of dancing,
a lot of celebrations.
That was Guadeloupe. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Everybody's dancing and singing all the time.
Right,
it's part of their
and if I'm very timid, they're like, "Are you okay?
Yeah.
You need food."
You're like, supposed to be happy all the time.
Yeah. And when we go to the States, it's more of a international aspect, but it's more of a open door policy, closed door policy. You know how it is. So, and it depends on the states as well. For me, it was Texas. It was the South. Right. So it wasn't. It depends on Northeast.
Your part of the country is much more laid back. Yeah, country pride. I mean, people in New York. I mean, it's understood that everybody complains and everybody's in a bad mood or whatever. So going from that background to go to Guadeloupe, people always be like, "Oh, what are you stressed out about?" You know what I mean? It's just it's a very distant kind of, very different kind of. I mean, growing up around island people and beaches and sand and being in the subway with the giant rats and you know what I mean. It's you are very much a product of your environment, regardless.
Right. So that's the term for me, code switching. I have to. It's a matter of survival.
You know, it's funny when you say that. I was having a conversation with a mutual friend of ours over dinner, and she's Ethiopian, but speaks perfect English. When the waitress comes, I think the waitress thought that she was the American one, and I was because she only speaks in English. The waitress, and I'm like, well, why do you do that? And she said, well, my mind, she doesn't code switch as easily. Like, you know what I mean? I think people who jump around, this is one of the things we learn to do.
Actually, for us, I mean, sorry.
No.
For us, I mean, for me personally, it's like it's very easy. It just, it goes out of you. It's not something that is pressured. It's like you talk Amerindian woman and you talk French and you talk it's just you talk English, or if I know another language like Spanish or something, Espanol.
Do you enjoy bringing people together from these different cultures? Like if you have a friend who's one language, do you enjoy that interaction? Because it can be awkward for a lot of people.
Let me give you an example. So I have a best friend. She's from Tanzania. I knew her back in my Greek school days. Her name is Martha, by the way. She's a lawyer. We knew each other when we were 6 years old. I remember the first time I met her, she was very out of place, very alone. She never fit in, and I was like, "Hi, my name is Bailey. Nice to meet you." And she's like, "Hi, my name is Martha," and we just bonded left and right. And for her, embracing Ethiopia still blows my mind. She knows what tips is. She knows how to make injera.
Oh, yeah.
She knows kitfo.
I don't know if people in Ethiopia realize how much people outside of Ethiopia love Ethiopian food. Like, it's,
especially tips. She's a tips person.
I've seen white people in America,
tips.
yeah, looking at me like they'll taste something with barbari for the first time, really anything with barbari, and look at me like, how have I not discovered this before? You've seen the episode of The Simpsons, right?
Yeah.
Where the taste buds are dancing on the tongue to Ethiopian music.
Yeah.
I mean, so.
And for her, so my mom usually, like, when she packs me lunch, is like shiro with gomen or kitfo, and me introducing my culture for Martha, I was like, what is this? This is injera. What is this? This is shiro. You put this and you eat this and manamin.
It's very odd to people.
Of course, I mean,
very
which is very true. It's for me, eating her national food with like ugali or like beans and rice and what is familiar and what makes her happy. It's like food is home at the end of the day, you know? That's how you express yourself and where you come from.
For anybody who has gone who's used to Ethiopian food, who has gone like a month without it, then you start craving it, then you have it at some restaurant.
It's not just Ethiopia, by the way. It could be like Haiti or Somalia, whatever.
I think especially Ethiopian food, because Ethiopian food is objectively very good. But of course you feel that.
Way.
But when you have it for the first time in a month or something like that, it's like.
I think it's the bunna effect.
Feeling,
It's the bunna effect.
What do you mean by the bunna?
Bunna effect is like, remember when people, like foreigners, an example, like the first sniff of bunna sikola,
that
they're
wakes
like,
you right up.
What is that? What is
wake up and smell the coffee.
They're like very like intoxicated with our bunna smell. They're like, Mandina, how do you roast this? And I'm like, oh, this is bunna. What type of bunna? It's Jeffy, it's Harid, it's Jimma, and you know, with the history, and they're like, oh my god, and they started falling in love with our coffee. For me, that's how
they do.
The bunna effect, that's how
we do have some better. That's why Starbucks and so on.
So, that's basically how I see it.
But see, when you talk about shifting languages, though, when we're talking about shifting languages, when I was a kid, most of my family learned French because they were here and they went to lycée. But regardless, everybody spoke French, everybody spoke English, everybody spoke Amharic. In a way, it's great. We mix around, and we're not even aware of, like, but then we'll start a sentence in one language, we'll go to a verb in a different language, and we'll finish that sentence in their language, and we're not even paying attention. You know, it's just when we're together,
it flows.
But at the same time, that's not always a good thing, right? Because then it's whatever comes easily to you, and you don't have to belabor.
You know, it's not good.
And you train yourself for that, and you can't always do that with other people.
No, you can't. That too, and it's not good for your mental health as well. You're gonna have an identity crisis. You're like, who am I? Because I've experienced that. It's like, okay, I know I'm black. I know I'm a female. I know I'm human. But what am I? I had to question.
Over the others?
I felt that way because it's like, remember, I don't know if anyone can resonate, but us trying to pick a side of where we're going to apply to colleges or what type of majors that we have to take or what type of sides of friends that we have to take in our lives. It's just an example. But for me, it's like, oh, which one is best? Ethiopia? Which one is best? Haiti?
And there's no way to avoid it. People don't realize this. There's no way to avoid it because by the act of avoiding, like I kind of avoided it. I was like, I don't want to think about it. I don't care, right? By avoiding it, you're still taking a side. You're still making a choice. Just by even if it's subconscious, right? If you decide I don't care who I hang out with based on their color, and you end up hanging out with mostly white people because you go to this, that's a choice that you made, whether you made it consciously or not, right? So it is forced upon you, right? And I always notice that it is a strange paradox in America in particular, or any place where there are minorities, is the people who have this forced on them, who have it imposed on them, and have it define their experience of the United States, are usually the ones who are most often accused of imposing it on others. Like I've seen footage of the 1950s of a white talk show host going to a black writer like, why is it always about race? Like, why do you guys always impose?
Let me give you a
and it's like, it's funny. You really think that black people imposed racial structure on white people?
Let me give you a good example on this. On a follow up.
Yeah.
Let's take Josephine Baker for an instance. You know who's?
No, I don't. Who is that?
Okay, so Josephine Baker is an American actress, a performer, and an activist. So I don't want people just look her up, Josephine Baker. I don't want to talk about her for a while, but to make the context short. So she was born in the 1950s. I'm not sure about the exact date. In the midst of the slave a part like slave era, but back in the 50s in I forgot the state where she was.
Okay,
from.
well,
It doesn't matter. Anyways, Richa, yeah. So she had a gift for performing arts. She was very like jolly and very, very, very good in how she performed. She loves dancing, Mlamen, and yeah, she couldn't take how America was very oppressive due to the black movement situation back in the 1950s and not. She decided to move to Paris. And then she started embracing French culture. She became a performer. She used to act. She was one of the most like beautifully both black, both African, both American, and both French, because like at the end of the day, yes, she was a part of French, yes, she is an American, but she stuck to herself as a true being, because like it doesn't matter where you're from, but you could have a home any place. So I hope people would see Josephine Baker's point of view and I don't know, try to resonate with her, learn her history, because she's very, very inspiring. For me, I look up to her in many ways, aside from Audrey Hepburn and other female characters that I love. But for me, Josephine is like a perfect example of how I define myself.
Well, thank you for that. I hope we all look into. I certainly am gonna look
I know
into
I'm talking gibberish left and right.
No, absolutely not. It's when you said it, when you started to do, I was like, I think I have heard of that person.
Yeah, like a banana skirt dress dance.
Right.
I hope people know her. She's
and now
amazing.
a lot of people like this are being rediscovered, like Mom's Mabel. Whoopi Goldberg has really done a project of bringing back Mom's Table. I mean, years ago, Alice Walker brought back Zora Neale Hurston, right?
Right.
Wrote Their Eyes Were Watching. It was kind of forgotten, and now is considered one of the great authors of that period. A lot of people get. There was this whole thing in the '60s where people rediscovering the blues from the '30s, and there was somebody named Mississippi John Hurt, I believe was his name.
Okay.
Was an artist from the '30s. By the time of the '60s, he was a much older artist, but he was kind of rediscovered by the '60s kind of folk blues music, and he's like an unbelievable blues artist. I'm not even a blues fan, so every so often it's good to go back and revitalize these people and kind of retell their stories.
Read, listen to podcasts. Always re-educate yourself as much as you can. It's not just about Black history. It could be African, it could be Arab, it could be like Europe history, it could be whatever. You need to re-educate as much as you can.
It's funny because it's in this other thing that I think is happening now with Black filmmakers as well. You've had Jordan Peele and Justin Simien and some of these young Black filmmakers. Boots Riley did a film. Spike Lee. That's what I was going to skip. Spike Lee is the one person that everybody kind of remembers from the '90s.
Because he was so phenomenal. He
was. But it's amazing to me that people have kind of forgotten that there was a whole wave of Black filmmakers, commercial Black filmmakers, that came up with Spike Lee, or who kind of followed Spike Lee's lead.
Especially female directors.
Absolutely.
Like Love and Basketball.
Right.
I forgot her name.
Well, yeah.
She was phenomenal.
But see, that's the whole point. We're forgetting these names now. It's in the 90s. Yeah.
Right.
Because, there were directors, Mario Van Peebles, who was the son of Melvin Van Peebles. And I invite anybody to see the film Badass. It sounds like an insult. It's badass, and he plays his own. It tells the story of his father, Melvin Van Peebles, who did a film called Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, and it's the first film that started the blaxploitation movement. People didn't realize there was a market for that, and the whole thing is how he's battling all the odds, and he is himself like a badass, like a 1970. He seems like Shaft or some guy like that, but he's a filmmaker. He reminds me
of Malcolm X,
right?
And very defiant.
Yeah, and he's telling his own story about the whole cool '70s blaxploitation thing, and he screens the film, and at first it's like nobody's coming to see it or whatever, and then suddenly it's a blockbuster, and it creates this whole explosion to which we are still indebted, like the 1970s blaxploitation film. So Mario Van Peebles, his son. Is the one who directed New Jack City. You see New Jack City with?
I haven't, but I've heard a lot about that.
One of the films that broke out Wesley Snipes, and it was Chris Rock's first appearance in anything.
Okay.
You had a number of these are. John Singleton came out then. F. Gary Gray, who recently did the Straight Outta Compton film, who did Friday. You know what I mean? There are all these directors who are, I mean, they're around, and people who know kind of do appreciate them, but it's people kind of think, oh, Spike Lee, that's the one 90s black filmmaker, and it's like, you know, it's the Isley brothers, you know, the Wayans brothers, you know. So I hope we don't forget about that generation either.
As well as Ethiopian phenomenal filmmakers as well.
Absolutely. The real pioneer being Haile Gerima.
And now I love his movie Beza.
Yeah, his son.
Anytime I can watch that movie.
His son Marawi Gerima just made a film, which I'm really looking forward to seeing about the experience. I don't know what the film's called. I should look it up, but it's about the experience of gentrification and the way it destroyed communities, especially, I mean, D.C. used to be a certain kind of city. Now it's a different kind of city, right? And so that's also part of what we were talking about adaptation and being a chameleon. Is somebody who was like that and who was a supreme talent is Dave Chappelle. Dave Chappelle, I don't know if people know this, Dave Chappelle's mother was an advisor to Patrice Lumumba, and an incredibly educated, pioneering woman. His father was from rural Ohio. So when he would go off to the farms, he had this connection to the rural areas. He had a connection to the suburbs, and also he had lived in D.C. during the height of the
60s movement?
or later in the 80s, the crack babies. So all this is to say that Marawi Gerima's film kind of deals with how D.C. turned around. And I remember Dave Chappelle in the first stand-up, especially he did famous one, Killing Him Softly, where he's wearing the blue, you know, where he's telling the great joke about the baby and on the street corner, you know, and while he's in the limousine and the baby's selling drugs, and how basically like it's a class analysis, right? Like a rich guy in a limousine is afraid of going into the ghetto. Anyway, Dave, the first thing he does, he's in D.C., he's back after all those years after having grown up there, and he goes to his own and goes, D.C. is different. D.C. is different. He looks around with this kind of smirk on his face and goes, a lot of white people walking around all of a sudden, right? Like, and this is what I've noticed is even the last time that I went to the States is this gentrification thing.
The world always revolves at ever
You see
changes.
it within a few year period, right?
It's even more fast, I think, in terms of change. I mean, always.
And it's a dangerous thing because on the surface it seems, well, this is great. You know, they've revitalized, the crime is down, and Disney has taken over. This is what happened to New York City in the 90s under Giuliani. But usually that means that all these communities are being dispersed and destroyed and sent out to the margins, and it's very silent. It's done very silently. So
I want to ask you though, how is your intake on terms of like, you know, being
what you were talking about before?
Yeah, cross-sectional.
So I mean,
like edge and stuff.
Yeah, my life was. I mentioned New York in the 90s, right? Because I was born in New York in the 80s. We left in the early 90s. Then we came back and lived in Jersey in the suburbs some years later, after having been in West Africa and Senegal. By the way, some of the best music that we listened to in West Africa was actually Caribbean music. Zouk music was very popular.
For us, it's Kumba for Haitians.
Right, Kumba. Right, for like Guadeloupe, Martinique, the connection was more. I think there was a stronger connection for some reason. Maybe the colonial connection with France was still stronger, right? Because those states are still part of France, whereas Haiti rebelled under Toussaint Louverture, the slave rebellion, 200 years before. But West Africa, we had this connection to Kassab and the Zouk music and all that. But so there was always that sense, and Senegal very much had Senegal and Addis Ababa to me. And those are the two cities that I'm most familiar with. I know that there are other examples, but feel like these like epicenters of black nationalism and of like black cosmopolitanism and connection. Senegal and Ethiopia have a very strong connection. Where I lived before I came to Ethiopia, Harlem, also has very much that sense of connection. There's Little Senegal, 116th Street. Our friend who's coming on the podcast, who's from New York, was out there. So anyway, long story short, I was in Senegal, and then we come back, and I live in the suburbs of Jersey, which was incredibly boring and bland, but right outside of the city, and the city was a different place. I mean, it was unrecognizable, like Fifth Avenue had expanded. So like sometimes even, my point in all this is, sometimes when you go back somewhere, like I just went back to California, I just went back to San Francisco after 10 years. I was hanging out in the Mission District.
That's how I feel with Houston, by the way.
Right. You come back and you can't go home again. Right. You can't go. So you end up being a chameleon in terms of time and not just in terms of place.
That's what I said, shapeshifter. But you just
Right,
run
not
against
just
time.
adapting to like changes geographically, but also changes temporally, right? It changes in terms of adapting over the course of your life. So in a sense, we are all, chameleons who are out of place. We are all in place and out of place.
More is more,
but some
out
more than
there.
others. Yeah.
More.
So, with us, it's, and what I would say is, in a way, it's a cool thing. In a way, it's a great thing to be able to access.
You have this international mindset.
Absolutely, and even interpersonally, I'll meet somebody of any background. I feel like the first thing I think of is, what do I have in common? What song do I know from that country? Or
what do I want to know?
Yeah, what do I want to know? Or hey, tell me. Yeah, exactly. It's so much fun to approach somebody that you don't know. Be like, oh, you're from this. Okay, tell me about that. Or hey, let me tell you. So, or do you remember the sports game from 10 years ago involving your country in the World Cup?
It could be like
anything,
music,
anything,
fashion.
right? Anything memorable, right? And that's how you form that connection. The problem when you're out of place, when you're different, and I think this is true for any of us who have been, like a lot of us who are in America and who are in the suburbs or whatnot, the one black guy. The one black guy with a bunch of white people. In my college dorm freshman year, I was the one black guy, the whole bunch of white and Asian, and hearing always about affirmative action. And,
I've never had that experience because I grew up all my entire life here. I've never had that. I mean, of course, I've learned in international schools or whatever, but
it can be difficult. It can be difficult because here's the thing: everybody's getting along. It's not that these people are racist. People
it's not about racism. It's just that feeling off type of.
Yeah, I mean. People have this perception. Well, so racism. People here. I have to kind of explain this. They're like, so you go to America and like racism is like you get shot dead by the cops. Like, no, it's more the microaggression, the subtle thing that kind of piles up over time. But really, what it is it's not that white people are any different than black people or anything like that.
They feel the same way.
That absolutely. It's just that if one white person and a group of 100 black people, the thing is when you have a conflict, because human beings come into conflict, either a petty little argument. Or more significant, if you're in high school, it might be over fighting over a girl, or it might be
competing
over grades, or over a teacher line, or going into
popularity,
or going into college. So, for instance, what I really felt was I was really saddened when I got into a good school, and a lot of people I thought were friends of mine, who were close to friends of mine, were angry at me. For doing what I was supposed to do. Well, because they figured
I felt that.
Affirmative action. Yeah, it is such a bizarre. The anti-affirmative action is so bizarre. It's like, I'm sorry, what was I supposed to do? Now, and do you understand the implication here is that if all things being equal, white people are just smarter than black people, right? And they just confront this to your face, and it's just like this is unbelievable. Because the people who said this to me knew that I was smarter than many of the, if not all, but many of
mine is a little bit different than yours. I'll explain.
I mean, they knew that I was hardworking. They knew that I had gotten the grades. They knew that I was able to express myself. They knew I had the activities, and still it was like, you stole this. Like, you're a thief. You know what I mean? From it more inherently.
Right.
And so anytime there's a conflict, I'm going to make a high-minded reference here, and I apologize, because every time I
to anyone offended?
No, not offended, but but who thinks this might sound pretentious. But really quickly, because when I drop this name, people go, oh my God. Shakespeare, right? Othello is about a black man. And in Othello, it's a descent into hell. And it's a tragedy about envy and jealousy of this one black guy who's at the head of the Venetian army. And his position is there because in Venetian law they would always have a foreigner because they had to keep the army at bay. So they would clamp it down by having somebody from abroad, right? Long story short, everything at first is fine in Othello. Everybody, the white people, the black, everybody's getting along. It's a honeymoon period. It's very open-minded and high-minded. Shakespeare sees a lot of this coming. I saw this in 2008 when Obama was elected, and then 2 years later when people were taking to the streets and the Tea Party movement, and they were putting up all these horrifying images.
Of course,
but
music and it was so horrific.
What happened in 2 years? This is what happens in Othello. At the end of the Act 1, I believe, there's a war. There's the Turkish-Venetian War breaks out. He's a general, right? So at some point there's going to be conflict. And that's the metaphor, is once a conflict is introduced, once somebody, in the case of Iago, the villain, didn't get the promotion that he wanted, he's full of jealousy, so he manipulates this other guy.
It's human nature. At the end of the day.
So all this is to say, once a conflict is introduced, yeah, you're right, human nature is, and you stand out for your skin color. Human nature also says that you're wrong. I'll put it this way, right? I mean, we have divisions along ethnicity, nationalism here. If we were 10 people were to appear in a room, like we're thrown into a room, we don't know how we got there, we don't know who put us there, we don't know why we're there, or how long we'll be there. We're just kind of like life. 10 people are thrown into a room randomly, and 9 people naturally have hats stitched onto their heads. But one person doesn't. Everybody in that room knows that hats are completely arbitrary. Who cares if you have a hat on or not? But guess what? A conflict arises, the guy without the hat is at a massive disadvantage. Just because human beings obsess over differences. It's an evolutionary
thing. It's all
thing.
about familiarity and getting that acceptance of, social circle okay? I feel like the code of the day or the word of the day is taqabbaynet, the acceptance.
Approbation.
Taqabbaynet, acceptance. How are we accepted amongst others and our society and the world?
We all seek approval.
Of course, approval, exactly.
Is, whom do we seek approval from? From whom do we seek approval? Right? So who do I choose? When I go into a situation, whose approval am I looking for, and what do I do to gain that approval? Right? And of course, your skin color. If you're markedly different.
Wait, let me go back to that point on your point. So for me, it's more of a all my life I've lived here. I mean, I go back and forth, but in terms of life, I was based here. And now, when I was back in my school days, when I was learning in international schools, and when my dad comes and neighbors and go to teacher I hate when they ask me this question. They always say, they're like, don't you always want to go back to America?
Isn't it better? Yeah.
Isn't it better?
I love the question I always get is, which is better?
God.
Which one do you prefer?
They don't say that.
I always got the which one do you prefer, but
I think it's better. I think yours is better. For me, it's
they assume, of course you want to go to
America. So, and I hate it when people ask me, your face is different. You don't look Habesha.
Right.
And I'm reluctant to act.
I get that all the time. And I'm actually fully Habesha. I'm actually fully a
For me, it makes sense. I'm all over the place. But they're like, they ask my mom. And
as if there aren't a bunch of Ethiopians, tens of millions
who
of
look like Arabs.
Who look
Asians.
Arabs, who look like, quote unquote Africans, as if Ethiopians are
or
Africans.
Latinos.
Yeah, but we have this mentality. Yeah, we have this mentality.
I'm she's American.
But you understand, part of that is envy, right? Because so many people, and when I say envy, not in a negative way, but people here
I wish I had that type of thing.
But people want to go to
I wish I had
America.
her life type of thing.
People want to go to America. It's that simple. For so many people, the ideal is going to America, not just here.
It could be other country.
Or Western Europe, America,
or Sweden,
right?
German,
and everybody wants to leave. But see, I also think this is very helpful to people's mindset. This is where you and I are at a disadvantage. When you move around this much, you realize that everywhere you go, your problems follow you, right? Because people have this fantasy, if I were to just go to this island and build there's a lot of poetry about this. Romantic poetry is
very philosophical.
It's I'm gonna go out to Lake Innisfree and build a log cabin there and be with the
a castaway,
I swear,
setup.
Romanticism, transcendentalism, naturalism. It's all based on I want to go out and I want to find enlightenment, or I want to find transcendence in the natural world.
It's all about Tom Hanks' movie Castaway vibe.
Sure. There's all this romanticism in it. And the thing is, it's helpful to people, because I know people here who are it's exactly. But this is where we're in a disadvantage.
Okay,
because we know that that's not how it works. That you could be in America, you could be in Houston, you're still going to deal with people, you're still going to have maybe slightly different problems, but life is suffering, and that's inevitable, right? And that can be really difficult to deal with, because people here compartmentalize. They'll be like, oh, it's because this is Ethiopia. You don't understand. This is the way it is in Ethiopia. And it's well, first of all, to me that bothers me, because I'm like, well, it doesn't have to be, and the fact that people accept this is part of why it continues, right? But I understand that this is what people do for their mental health, but it's also to tell themselves, oh, everything's perfect in America, right? That's what they're selling you. Don't you want to go back to America? Everything's perfect in America, right? And of course, a lot of things are better in America, don't get me wrong.
No.
A lot of things
We're not taking anything for granted, by the way.
Yeah. Right, so you agree with me, right?
Of course.
Materially, a lot of opportunities, wealth, wages, etc.
But there's some things in here or other African countries that are much better.
I would much rather raise kids here.
In terms of freedom and mental health and acceptance and family.
Absolutely. Social solidarity, the fact that labor is cheap, and if you have some means, you can hire someone to help you.
And the
I don't know how much people realize
here.
there are a lot of things are saturated market-wise. If you want to start a business out there, there's a million other people who've already started that business. I know Americans who came out here 10 years ago were saying this is the frontier, developing country, right? Really wealthy, really well-educated Americans who were like, some developing country. That's where things have not been done yet, and there's all this opportunity to start stuff that we has already been done 1,000 times in America. So there's a bunch of advantages, but in people's minds, it's helpful. It's helpful to say, whatever problem I have, if I just left the country, it helps them deal with it, to put that in that little compartment of, this is a problem because we're in Ethiopia, right? And people like us who are transitional all the time don't have that luxury.
It's very hard to deal with. Very hard in terms of like in your teen and like childhood age. It's very hard to deal with yourself in terms of accepting what you are. Because honestly speaking, back in my like childhood days, I was afraid to talk French or Amharic or English, like, or in a certain way, because I felt like I was being judged for it. It really took a toll on my confidence for a long time, because I have to, that's what I said, sometimes code switching takes a toll on your mental health, because it does. Because I kind of felt like, okay, if I do this, right, if I do this, like I'll be accepted, I won't ruff any feathers with anyone, and not, it was very, very difficult per se. I hopefully people who resonate with us could understand where we're coming from. I want to have this conversation because I want people to understand, there is this type of situation for people who feel this way, like me and Zodi, and
absolutely. And it's almost to the point where, because I went to international schools, and a lot of us who went to international schools, like, to me, by the 90s, it was like, we kind of got bored with it, like, the whole, like,
how was it back then?
It was cool, because it was a little too good, in the sense that it was between, it was in these American schools, even here you had ICS, between the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the War on Terror, where, there were problems. There was Rwanda, there was problems all over the world, but those were good years. In retrospect, those were nice, peaceful, end of history, president of the moment, kind of international liberal world order. We kind of fell into this complacent kumbaya thing. But at the same time, what I wish they had told us is, just remember, this is not the way the world really is. You're in a little petri dish of like, the way the world should be, but that is not the way the world is. Yeah. And that's a distinction that people often miss out on, the way things should be versus the way they are. But, regardless, for those who grew up in that, it became cliched. It became cliched to read about racism and how horrible it was. It got to the point where it was boring. I had a black female teacher in 8th grade who had like almost a rebellion on her by the white students, because they were mad at her for always talking about segregation, whatever. But they didn't realize that she was assigned to that because that was in the curriculum, right? And I experienced the same thing as a teacher 10 years later, 12 years later, and teaching high school. It was really, really annoying, because I couldn't help the fact that I was being told to teach black boy and I liked teaching them. But also, immediately, it was like, here's another black guy with another black book about black people and black things. And again, it feeds into that whole, what I said,
natives and stuff like.
Very real. Actually, that was the one thing I was trying to get on the curriculum, was a book by Sherman Alexie, Native American author.
Right.
It was called which I highly recommend. Even though the guy's a bit of a creep, he's had sexual harassment complaints. I've heard him speak. He's a genius guy, but he's also kind of a crazy person. But he wrote a book called The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, which is a classic, and it's a young adult novel.
So that's why, really, since you're an educator, I'm asking you this, because there is black education, there's Asians, there's Asian Americans, there's Latinos.
But there aren't enough Native Americans to really push.
Especially Native Americans.
Yeah. We talked about the whole Native American plight last time on it, but I just,
it's kind of sad.
Yeah, it's absolutely sad, but it's.
I would kill myself if I was a Native American.
Well, I don't know about that.
Okay, I'm not good. That's very dramatic, but I wouldn't do that. But it's just, how would I feel if
I mean, it's a very difficult situation that they are put in, but it's also, what I notice is, everybody reads The Diary of Anne Frank in middle school, and it's a great book, don't get me wrong. Lois Lowry's book, Number the Stars, which is set in Denmark. Well, I mean specifically Holocaust-oriented books. So Number the Stars by Lois Lowry is a middle school book about, set in Denmark, I believe, about the Jews there. we learned and we also taught a book by Eli Wiesel, who I think might still be alive. He's a Holocaust survivor from when he was a teenager. I think he's about 100 years old. But it's called Night, and it's a very harrowing, very dark portrait, of course, of the Holocaust. And I was like, yes, but this also creates what people call selective empathy. Right? It's not like the Jewish people were the only people who were... And of course, we should talk about it. We should never forget. But it is kind of ironic that they say this in a country where the whole Western Hemisphere, right, had just genocided its Native American population, and nobody really talks about it. Nobody makes films about it. Nobody writes books about it. If they do, it's usually a white guy who's the good guy, Kevin Costner or something like that. But you know what I mean? Nobody really tells the story from their point of view. But everybody's like, hey, let's not forget about that what happened to the Jewish people, in another country, right? As if those people are so terrible, but we would never commit a genocide. But everybody knows that's not the case. But anyway, getting back to
our point,
getting back to the cliched nature of this. Being in the '90s, it was so cliched. We were so used to it, it got boring, the whole like kumbaya thing, and it's to the point that people started rebelling. Some people called this the early days of political correctness. And now there's been a huge backlash to political correctness embodied in Donald Trump and the reactionary movement throughout the world. And fascism, the reversion towards like cultural reaction. And all of the problems that have come with that. But it was so cliched to us that for a lot, I remember a few years ago I heard some woman who I think was Taiwanese American, and she was like,
it's actually with Haitian politics as well. It's like back in the 1950s and 1940s, like Haiti was before like the political abrupts and the earthquakes.
Sure, Papa Doc and all,
it's a symbol of pride. Right. Yeah, but due to circumstances, it's not the place where it's
things kind of went off the rails in the 70s, much like they did throughout Africa.
In any country.
Right, there is that connection, too.
And I just hate it when people Selective Empathy, Balkonega, they're like, where are you from? I'm Haitian American, I'm Habesha. They're like, oh, Haiti. Oh my God, you guys are like Republican. And they're like, no, in terms of Republic.
Oh, Republican, right.
Because, man, that's so cool. But you guys, the earthquake.
Yeah.
Holding up.
Right, that does get a little annoying too. The pitiful people get that coming from here, right? If you're Ethiopian in the 80s and 90s, oh my God, are you okay after the famine?
No, that's good. That's good.
But you know what I mean?
Like,
it's similar famine.
It's not offensive. It's kind of annoying, like in terms of like I tell them about my life, manamin, and they hear and they're like, so let me get this straight. Your mom is Orthodox and your dad is Lutheran, but does he practice hoodoo?
You get that here?
Voodoo. And in the States, it's Zimbabwe. They're like,
Texas is very religious. See, in New York, nobody would care. New York, nobody would care. Nobody would be like, okay, I've heard that story.
They might be interested.
Right, but you know what I mean. They wouldn't be like weirded out.
Do you practice witchcraft? Do you have a little voodoo doll? And I'm like, no.
Right.
It's very annoying. I just wanted to put on.
I mean, Texas is a pretty I had a friend.
I mean,
I
love Texas. I am.
No, but it's very religious, very sectarian society. I had a very good friend who was. I told you that I did a road trip through Texas. It was to go to his place in Houston. The one time that I visited you. He was a good close friend of mine. He was a Catholic, white guy. He was a Catholic around Protestants, and he got way worse crap than I would ever get around white people. And then because he was Catholic, like he was abused for being different, because it's not even a visible thing, right? Again, in New York, in New Jersey, California, that would be kind of unthinkable. But what I was saying about that woman, the Taiwanese American woman who I saw on TV a few years ago, saying like she found it so interesting. Like probably some people might react to us talking like this in that way. Like I grew up in Taiwan, but when I'm in America, I'm Taiwanese. But when I'm in Taiwan, I'm American. Oh my God, isn't that so interesting? And I was like, to me, it's like it's not interesting. It's like really cliche because again, I grew up in a situation where I know plenty of people who are transplants or this or that. So what? This is the modern world. Everybody moves around. You're not the only one.
It's not.
But at the same time, it's not that interesting. It's not important. It's not significant to me unless there's a conflict, unless there's antagonism thrown in. And this is human nature. Because then the fact that you are different puts you at a massive disadvantage, right? As long as everybody's getting along, the fact that you're different, nobody cares.
It's like a utopian world, and I guess.
Right, you just got to make sure you stay out of conflicts. If you're the one black person in a group of white people, and I wish I had told myself this years ago when that was the case, just know you're fine. Just be careful what you say and do, because you do not want to get into any antagonism with anybody here, because you are automatically going to have everybody gang up on you. That's as you call it, human nature, right? That's what it is. So.
It is what it is. Yeah. I hope people are enjoying our conversation. I mean,
if they're listening,
of course.
Assuming.
I mean, education is power, so
right.
I mean, I'm just giving a little piece of my life, so he's giving a little piece of his life.
So this is informal and obviously about the relationship between foreign and domestic. But if we're going to wrap up now, what are the lessons that you take about this educationally? Like if you're going to talk to a classroom of young people, either here or in the U.S. or whatever, what do you learn from this? You know, Ras Temari, like what do you learn from this? Your
particular
experience?
Episode?
I mean this discussion we just had and your experience dealing with being shapeshifter or.
I would have I'm just gonna talk to my inner child or my little self. I would have told her to always stay true to yourself and accept yourself no matter what. Acceptance, the road to acceptance for me was so hard to the point of I didn't care at all about my identity, and accept it, learn about your history, love yourself no matter what, where you came from. It doesn't matter if you came from planet Mars or if you came from planet Jupiter. It doesn't matter.
Either way, what matters is you accepting wherever you came from, wherever you are now. Yeah.
You are who you are. Alternative. Period.
I'm with you. It comes down to acceptance, and people aren't going to accept you unless you accept
That's
yourself.
my lesson.
Yeah, I know.
How about you?
I would say the point I was making earlier about beware of when the conflict comes, when the war with the Turks comes in Othello. That's when Othello needed to be on his heels. When somebody was having a conflict, people underneath him, and somebody had been passed up for a promotion. That guy wanted revenge on Othello for not giving him that promotion.
But in terms of
my experience with that is as long as just know when you are different, it's fine to be different. But when conflict emerges, antagonism emerges, just know you probably want to protect yourself even more, or get yourself out of that situation, or prepare for what's coming, because it is human nature for your difference, arbitrary as it may be, to be
used against you.
And that's you see this story another time. And then I want to give a real quick, because obviously I'm not a woman and therefore not a feminist and don't have the experience that women have. But what you were just saying, there's a great novel, one of the greatest novels written by a feminist literature. Self-acceptance and not seeking approbation in this context, right? As far as difference. There's a great novel called To the Lighthouse. I won't go on and on about it, but it's sort of told from within the mind, and it has no direct dialogue, no direct dialogue. It's by a woman named Virginia Woolf, many years ago, I think in the 1920s or something like that. And the first part of the book is, among other things, about a young woman who's trying to be a painter, who's trying to be an artist. And there's this guy who's a guest at the party that she's at, who points to the host, the patriarchal host figure, and he goes, "Why are you trying to compete with it? You can't be a painter. Women can't do this."
It's like a Colette, like the writer, the French writer. She's like, she's trying to be a writer, but the society's telling her, you can't be a writer. Right. Then she turns into a man. She has this pen name, Menamin. She continues. I'm having a little resemblance.
That sounds vaguely familiar. Was that
Colette? People check her. Yeah. Check the movie or check her work. She's amazing. I love her short stories.
Because there's also George Sand is like that.
I mean, I read the French version, but
George Sand is like a famous French writer who has a French name, or a man's name. George, she's a woman. She just went by, she was like this great writer who was a woman, because you couldn't be a woman. Right. And Emily Dickinson, the most famous American female poet, was an unknown until after she died, because she just kind of sat in her attic or in her room and wrote these poems that were amazing, but because she was a woman, there was no viability. But so Virginia Woolf starts off with that. That's how the book starts off, and it's still misunderstood as yet another example of men socially impose this, which is true, but that's only her starting point. That guy, the patriarch guy, who's like he's like a great philosopher, and the other guest at the party is like, what are you trying to be like an artist for? You're a woman, you can't do it. Look at this guy. Look at the patriarch at this. He's a great philosopher. He's a great intellectual. Blah 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 blah.
Comparing.
Yeah. Part 2 of the book. 10 years later, World War I has happened. We now see the story from the perspective of that great philosopher guy, that great intellectual guy. He's broken. He's old now because everybody suffers, as we said before, right? No matter where you are, what point you are in time or space. Everybody suffers. Absolutely.
Resilience.
And he has to be resilient.
Of course.
He has to be resilient because
I don't
he's
think
lost everything.
He did not become resilient.
No, he
broke
does.
Down at
He
the end.
does. He does. But see, he's old. He's feeling absence. He's trying to deal. But the thing is, even he, this great patriot, not only does he deal with absence and loss like everybody else does, but at the end of the book, at the end of that, like in that second part, his work starts to suffer as a result, right? Because again, that woman is trying to be a painter. She's trying to do something artistic, do something creative, and she looks at all this patriot guy. He's accepted as this great intellectual genius. Yes, but all that absence and loss and all that despair that he dealt with, it's affecting his ability to write. It's affecting his ability to complete. He can't complete his book because it's going off in different directions and it's painful to him, much like his life itself. Right. So his writing is much. Then we get to the third part and the final part of the book, when we catch up with that woman again, that young artist, and she has finished her painting. And at that point, she's decided, it was what we were talking about, approbation, approval. How do we seek other people's approval?
Acceptance.
And acceptance, right? The only real acceptance is by the execution of your vision. It only comes from yourself. That's what Virginia will.
Period.
Because if you need as a woman in that setting, you need a man's approval or a man's acceptance to
or
really,
society's,
or
by the
society,
way.
or anybody
For all
outside of
women
yourself.
and young girls out there.
Right. Or another woman's, or
men,
the black
by the
person's.
way.
If you need somebody else's acceptance, then you're playing the wrong game to begin with.
I mean,
Then the only real acceptance or the only real satisfaction comes from the execution of your own vision.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean,
That's
seeking like guidance from people, advice, knowledge is good, but you don't always need to be accepted by people. And it's okay to be a trailblazer, to be someone who is a little bit kooky and who's misunderstood. It's okay.
It's the best thing you could be, actually. It's beyond
okay. You can be happy. It makes you happy.
Right,
okay?
because the other thing is, what you'll often notice when you start, and this is the other point of looking at it from, in that second part of that book, looking at it from the problems that guy has. Right. That guy seems like he has it all, until you see his life 10 years later. Well, he's going to get old and he's going to lose his kids in World War I and so on. Like, when you start comparing yourself to other people and being like, well, why don't I have this person's acceptance, or what does this person say about me, or does this person judge about me? Almost always, what they're saying about you or their own issues is a reflection of their own biases, their own issues, their own insecurities.
Right.
Because everybody has weaknesses, insecurities, biases. So you could always be like, oh, this person, doesn't think of me the way I would like them to, or I don't get approbation from this person. But almost always that person's dealing with their own thing, and their relationship
and
to you
don't judge
is
them,
really
don't blame them, don't hate them for it. It is their life.
Absolutely, but their relationship to you is informed by their own issues,
Reflection.
their own problems, right?
Yeah.
So it's really just mirroring back at them. So it's what you said earlier. I think it's a really good point.
It's a very hard topic.
Right. Self-acceptance, right?
Let's
Self-love, trusting yourself, having faith in yourself, believing in yourself.
In terms of intuition as well, like trust your gut. I feel like a lot of people are not in touch with their inner calling, inner belief system, and I feel like, okay, I'm being a little spiritual on this and a little bit philosophical, which
It's good.
Inner. What was I saying again?
You were talking about the acceptance of self.
Oh, yes. And it starts with you.
Right.
When you question things, when you defy a little bit of logic in the world and the life, get to know. Like, you need to work on that. Especially if anything starts, it has to start with you, and it could be a trailblazer for longest years to come. And this is my input from my perspective.
We really appreciate having you on. We hope to have you on
so
more often. I think we're going to wrap up here. This has been a really good episode.
Very feisty, fired up. Yeah.
And we'll talk about these themes again.
Yes.
Hopefully more regularly, coming anytime. Along with the rest of our contributors, we have an open door policy. If anybody's listening, those of you who have to be contributors, this is what we're trying to build in the station. Is these kinds of conversations that have educational import. With the theme of the relationship between foreign and that which is uniquely Ethiopian, which Rastafarianism is obviously a prime example, well-known example of, hence playing on Rastafarianism with the term Ras Temari, and also the generational rifts that are emerging.
And education, Tamari.
And education, absolutely.
Life of Temari as a student of life.
Absolutely.
Basically.
And I think the other lesson is about education itself. The one lesson
I am an advocacy for education,
sure.
but you know how I feel about education, and that's good to know.
You can make the argument, and I'm hoping in my other work to make this argument and develop it, that much of Ethiopia's social and political changes and the development of the country, real shifts that have to do with missionary education, this kind of education, and exposure to this modern these ideas and that ideas, and the rifts that it creates within our society. That education, institutionality around education, and that this is one of the social. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you learn from life. You don't necessarily learn from the classroom. Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Institutions are what we can control more through policy. Yeah. But you're right. This is the kind of thing outside of the classroom is that we can learn from each other, because ultimately, I think the scariest problem we have in this country right now, the scariest social problem we have a lot of really educated people, we have a lot of great teachers, we have a lot of great institutions.
That's how
I'm not saying otherwise.
IT as well, but
is the education crisis. For me, it's the education crisis, because that has more lasting effects than any of the other stuff that people are fixated on. So hopefully we can talk more about the importance of education.
So any last words that you have to say? Or?
That's pretty much it. Those were I was like, what about you? Any last words?
Yeah, I'm proud to be Haitian, I'm proud to be American, and I'm proud to be Ethiopian through and through.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. Let's wrap up. All right, thanks everybody for listening. Bye.